My husband is forcing our daughter to quit ballet because the costumes are immodest. She's been dancing since she was 4. I was folding laundry in our bedroom when my husband David walked in, holding our daughter's ballet costume from last month's recital. The pink tutu and matching leotard were draped over his arm, and his face had that expression I'd learned to recognize over our 12 years of marriage. The one that meant he'd made a decision and expected me to fall in line without question. He dropped the costume on the bed between us and said we needed to talk about Lily's ballet classes. My stomach dropped before he even finished the sentence. I knew what was coming. He'd been making comments for weeks about the recital costumes, about how much skin they showed, about the inappropriateness of 10-year-old girls dressed that way on stage. I'd tried to deflect each time, changing the subject or pointing out that ballet costumes had looked the same for 100 years. But I could see him building toward something, and now here it was. David told me he'd decided Lily needed to quit ballet, not reduce her hours or skip certain performances, quit entirely. He said the costumes were immodest and he wasn't comfortable with our daughter being displayed that way in front of audiences. I asked him if he was serious, and he said he'd never been more serious about anything, that he'd prayed about it and felt convicted that continuing would compromise our family's values. I reminded him that Lily had been dancing since she was 4 years old, that ballet wasn't just a hobby for her but her entire identity, that she practiced in our living room every single day and fell asleep watching videos of professional dancers, that her studio director had told us multiple times she had real potential for a professional career if she kept training. David's jaw tightened, and he said that made it even more important to stop now before she got more attached, that worldly success meant nothing if we lost her soul in the process. I felt something shift inside me during that conversation, some line being crossed that I hadn't known existed until that moment. I told David we should talk to Lily before making any final decisions, that she deserved to have a say in something this important to her life. He shook his head and said, "Children don't get to make decisions about their moral upbringing. That was our job as parents." I asked him when he'd become so rigid about things that had never bothered him before. He'd been at every recital for 6 years, taking photos and videos, posting them proudly on social media. He'd never once mentioned concerns about costumes or modesty. He said he'd been blind to the problem, but his eyes were open now, that his men's Bible study group had been discussing the sexualization of children in society, and he'd realized we were participating in it. I wanted to argue but couldn't find words that wouldn't start a fight we'd never recover from. So I told him I needed time to think about it. He said there was nothing to think about. His decision was final. Then he left the room, and I sat there staring at that pink tutu, knowing everything was about to fall apart. That night at dinner, Lily talked excitedly about her upcoming audition for the winter showcase. She'd been rehearsing a solo for weeks, practicing until her feet bled through her point shoes. David let her talk for 5 minutes before he interrupted and told her she wouldn't be auditioning, that she was done with ballet effective immediately. The fork fell from Lily's hand and clattered against her plate. She asked what he meant, and her voice was so small and confused. David repeated that she was quitting ballet, that the costumes were inappropriate and he couldn't allow her to continue. Lily looked at me with these desperate eyes begging me to fix this. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. David kept talking, explaining about modesty and values and protecting her innocence. Lily started crying. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but quiet tears streaming down her face while she stared at her plate. I found my voice and told David this wasn't the right time for this conversation, that we should discuss it as a family when everyone was calmer. He said there was nothing to discuss. His decision was made. Lily pushed back from the table and ran to her room. I heard her door slam and started to follow, but David grabbed my wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop me. He told me I needed to support him on this, that undermining his authority would only make it harder for Lily to accept the change. I pulled my wrist free and told him he was breaking her heart. He said sometimes parents had to make hard choices, that she'd understand when she was older. I went upstairs and found Lily face down on her bed, surrounded by photos of ballet dancers she'd torn from magazines over the years. I sat beside her and rubbed her back while she cried. She kept asking why, and I didn't have an answer that made any sense. I told her I was going to try to change his mind. She lifted her head and asked if I really thought I could. The hope in her eyes made my chest ache because I knew the answer was probably no. David had that certainty in his voice that meant he'd already committed completely, but I promised her I'd try. She hugged me tight and whispered that ballet was the only thing that made her feel special, that without it she didn't know who she was supposed to be. I held her until she fell asleep, and then went downstairs to find David reading his Bible in the living room. I asked him to reconsider, to at least let Lily finish out the semester. He closed his Bible and looked at me with this patient expression that made me want to scream. He said I was too emotional to see the situation clearly, that I was thinking about Lily's temporary happiness instead of her eternal well-being. I told him that was insane, that ballet costumes weren't going to corrupt her soul. He stood up and his voice got harder. He said if I wasn't going to support his decision, then I should at least stay out of his way. Never. Over the next few days, I watched Lily move through the house carrying this devastating sadness. She'd start to practice her positions in the hallway and then stop, remembering she wasn't allowed anymore. She'd put on her favorite ballet music and then turn it off after 30 seconds. David acted like everything was normal, asking about her homework and her friends as if he hadn't just destroyed the thing she loved most. I called the studio director, a woman named Grace Carmichael who'd been teaching ballet for 30 years. I explained the situation and asked if there was any way to make the costumes more modest. Grace sighed and said she'd dealt with parents like David before, that she could have Lily wear a cover-up during rehearsals, but recital costumes were standardized by the performance company, that trying to alter them would make Lily stand out and potentially exclude her from group numbers. She asked if David would consider compromising on just the recital issue and letting Lily continue classes. I told her I'd ask, but didn't have much hope. Grace said she'd hold Lily's spot for 2 weeks in case we worked something out, that she'd hate to lose such a talented student. When I told David about Grace's offer to hold Lily's spot, he got angry. He said I'd gone behind his back and involved outsiders in a family decision. I told him I was trying to find a compromise that would let Lily keep dancing. He said there was no compromise on moral issues, that I needed to stop fighting him and start acting like a wife who respected her husband's leadership. That phrase made something snap in me. I told him I wasn't his employee or his subordinate, that we were supposed to be partners making decisions together. He said the Bible was clear about household leadership, and I knew that when we got married. I reminded him that I'd never agreed to check my brain at the door or let him control every aspect of our daughter's life. The fight escalated from there, both of us saying things we'd probably regret later. Finally, David told me I had a choice: support his decision about Lily's ballet or undermine our entire family structure. Then he left for his evening Bible study without another word. I sat in the kitchen shaking with anger and fear. Fear because I was starting to realize this wasn't just about ballet. This was about David's increasing rigidity around anything he perceived as worldly or impure. Over the past year, he'd been pulling away from old friends he decided were bad influences, criticizing movies and music he used to enjoy, spending more time with his church group and less time with our family. I'd noticed the changes but told myself it was just a phase, that he was working through something and would balance out eventually. Now I saw it wasn't balancing, it was accelerating. And Lily was caught in the middle. I went upstairs and found her in her room doing homework. I told her about Grace holding her spot and she looked up with sudden, desperate hope. I had to tell her that her father still hadn't changed his mind, but I was working on it. The hope died in her eyes and she went back to her math problems without saying anything. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Lily at 4 years old in her first ballet class, so tiny in her pink leotard with her hair in a messy bun. How she'd come home and shown me every step she'd learned, spinning in circles until she was dizzy. How ballet had given her confidence and discipline and joy. How David had been right there celebrating every milestone with us. What had changed in him? When had he decided that beauty and art were dangerous? The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent hours researching. I found articles about religious control in families, about parents who isolated their children from normal activities, about the long-term psychological damage of rigid authoritarian parenting. Everything I read made my stomach hurt. I found a family therapist named Dr. Nina Okafor, who specialized in religious families navigating conflict. Her website said she helped parents find healthy boundaries between faith and control. I called her office and explained our situation to her receptionist. She had an opening that afternoon and I took it without telling David. Dr. Okafor was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with kind eyes and a direct manner. She listened while I explained everything about the ballet and David's ultimatum and Lily's heartbreak. She asked thoughtful questions about David's religious community and when his views had started shifting. I told her about his men's Bible study group and how they seemed to reinforce each other's fears about secular culture. Dr. Okafor nodded and said she'd seen this pattern before. Men who felt powerless in other areas of their lives trying to exert total control at home in the name of spiritual leadership. She said the ballet issue was likely just the beginning, that David would probably find more things to restrict if this pattern continued. I asked what I should do. She said I had 3 options. Try to get David into couples counseling to address the underlying issues, set firm boundaries about shared parenting decisions, and refuse to comply with unilateral ultimatums, or prepare for the possibility that this marriage might not survive if David wasn't willing to compromise. The third option made my chest tight, but I knew she was right. I couldn't watch my daughter be crushed under increasingly rigid rules for the next 8 years until she turned 18. Dr. Okafor gave me the names of 2 family lawyers just in case. She said she wasn't encouraging divorce, but I needed to know my options, that protecting Lily might require hard choices. I left her office feeling both clearer and more terrified than when I'd arrived. That evening, I asked David if he'd be willing to see a counselor with me. He asked why, and I said because we were having serious disagreements about parenting and needed help finding middle ground. He said we didn't need a counselor. We needed me to stop fighting God's design for families. I told him I'd let Lily continue ballet while we worked things out in counseling. His face went dark, and he said if I contradicted his decision, he'd pull her from the studio himself and cancel our credit card so I couldn't pay the fees. I stared at him, trying to recognize the man I'd married. The David I fell in love with had been spontaneous and creative, writing me poems and taking me on surprise adventures. This David was someone else entirely, someone who saw threats everywhere and thought love meant control. I asked him what happened to us, to the partnership we used to have. He said he'd grown up and gotten serious about his faith, that he was sorry I wasn't mature enough to do the same. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time in our marriage. I could hear David moving around the house, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, doors closing with more force than necessary. In the morning, Lily found me making coffee in the kitchen and asked why I wasn't in my bedroom. I told her Dad and I had an argument. She asked if it was about her ballet, and her voice was so guilty. I hugged her and said it wasn't her fault, that adults sometimes disagreed about important things. She asked if we were getting divorced. The question hit me hard because I hadn't let myself think that word yet. I told her I didn't know what would happen, but that I loved her and would always protect her. She hugged me tighter and said she didn't want to be the reason our family broke apart. I told her she wasn't the reason, that this was about bigger issues than ballet, but I could see she didn't believe me. Over the next week, the tension in our house became unbearable. David and I communicated only through short, necessary sentences. Lily walked on eggshells around both of us. I contacted a family lawyer named Rebecca Thornton, who Dr. Okafor had recommended. Rebecca had 20 years of experience in custody cases involving religious disagreement between parents. I met her at her office downtown on a Friday afternoon. She wore a sharp gray suit and had a no-nonsense demeanor that I found reassuring. I explained the ballet situation and David's increasing rigidity, and my fear that it would only get worse. Rebecca took detailed notes and asked specific questions about David's behavior and any history of control or aggression. I told her he'd never been physically abusive, but the emotional control had been ramping up over the past year. She asked if I had documentation of any of this. I said no, and she told me to start keeping records immediately. Write down every incident with dates and details. Save any text messages or emails. Document Lily's emotional state. Build a clear timeline of David's escalating restrictions and their impact on our daughter. Rebecca explained that family courts prioritize the child's best interests above parental rights or religious beliefs. If I could show that David's restrictions were causing Lily emotional harm, I'd have a strong case for primary custody. But I needed evidence. She said not to tell David I was consulting a lawyer yet. That would likely escalate things and give him time to prepare his own case. I left her office with a folder of information about custody law and a knot in my stomach. This was really happening. I was preparing to leave my husband and fight for my daughter. That night, I started a journal documenting everything. Lily's tears when David announced the ballet ban, his refusal to consider compromise, his statements about household authority, the way Lily had stopped practicing and listening to music, how she'd become withdrawn and sad. Writing it all down made it more real and more clear that this situation was harming her. I also started recording our conversations with my phone when David and I discussed parenting, not to be sneaky, but to have accurate records of what was actually said. In one conversation, he told me that wives who challenged their husbands brought chaos into their homes, that I was making Lily's adjustment harder by not submitting to his leadership. I asked him if he heard how he sounded. He said I'd been corrupted by feminist ideas and needed to realign with biblical truth. I stopped the recording and asked if he really believed that. He said yes, completely. That the modern church had gotten soft on gender roles and it was destroying families. I realized there was no reasoning with him. He'd built an entire worldview around male authority and female submission, and anything that challenged it was treated as an attack on God himself. Grace Carmichael called me the following week. She said Lily's 2-week hold was about to expire, and she needed to know if Lily was coming back. I told her honestly that I was fighting for it, but my husband was blocking me. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she'd be willing to offer Lily a full scholarship for the rest of the year if financial barriers were an issue. That she'd seen too many talented girls forced out of dance by controlling parents, and she wasn't going to let it happen to Lily without a fight. I felt tears sting my eyes at this woman's generosity. I told her I couldn't accept without my husband's permission. She said the offer would stand regardless, that if I found a way to bring Lily back, the scholarship would be there. I thanked her and hung up, feeling both grateful and more trapped than ever. I had resources and support, but none of it mattered if David physically prevented Lily from attending. That evening, David announced he'd enrolled Lily in a girls' Bible study program at church that met 3 times a week, the same hours she used to have ballet. Lily's face went blank when he told her. She didn't cry or argue, just nodded and said, "Okay." After dinner, she went to her room and I followed. She was lying on her bed staring at the ceiling. I asked if she was okay and she said she was fine in that flat tone kids use when they're anything but fine. I sat on the edge of her bed and told her I was still fighting for her ballet. She rolled over to face the wall and said it didn't matter anymore. That Dad was going to win because he always won. that I should stop trying because it just made everything worse. The resignation in her voice scared me more than her tears had. She'd given up, accepted that her dreams didn't matter and her voice didn't count. I told her not to give up hope, that things might change. She didn't respond. I left her room and went downstairs where David was reading on the couch. I told him what Lily had said about giving up hope. I asked if he could see what he was doing to her spirit. He said she was learning an important lesson about obedience and trust. That short-term disappointment was acceptable if it led to long-term character development. I asked him if he remembered the little girl who used to dance in our living room, who'd light up whenever music played, who'd dreamed of performing on real stages someday. He said he remembered a child who needed guidance to stay on the right path. I realized he genuinely couldn't see it, couldn't see the light going out in our daughter's eyes. Or maybe he could see it and thought it was necessary. Either way, I knew I couldn't reach him. The next morning, I made a decision. I told Lily to get her ballet bag and her gear. She looked confused and asked why. I said we were going to class. She said Dad would be furious. I told her to let me worry about that. We drove to the studio in silence. When we walked in, Grace saw us and her whole face brightened. She hugged Lily and told her how happy she was to see her. Lily started crying and Grace just held her and said it was okay, that she was home now. I watched my daughter transform in that moment. The light coming back into her eyes, her shoulders straightening, her fingers already moving through positions she'd been forbidden to practice. Grace pulled me aside while Lily changed into her practice clothes. She told me she'd set up the scholarship and that Lily could start immediately. She also said she'd dealt with situations like this before, and that I should know she'd testify in court if necessary about Lily's emotional state and her talent. That she'd seen the before and after, and could speak to the harm of keeping her from dance. I thanked her with tears in my eyes. Then I sat and watched Lily's class. Watched her move across the floor with this freedom and joy that had been missing for weeks. Watched her smile for the first time since David had banned her from the studio. When class ended, Lily ran to me and hugged me hard. She whispered thank you over and over. I told her we'd figure this out, that I wasn't going to let her dreams die without a fight. On the drive home, she asked what Dad was going to do when he found out. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that there would probably be a big fight. She went quiet, and then asked if we could live somewhere else. Just the two of us. The question made my heart break and also gave me courage. My daughter was asking for escape. That meant staying was hurting her more than I'd realized. When we got home, David's car was in the driveway even though he should have been at work. My stomach dropped. Lily grabbed my hand and squeezed. We walked in through the garage and found David standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed. He asked where we'd been. I told him the truth, that we'd gone to Lily's ballet class. His face went red and he told Lily to go to her room. She looked at me and I nodded. She went upstairs and I heard her door close. David started yelling, asking how I dared to directly disobey him, to undermine his authority in front of our daughter, to teach her that his decisions didn't matter. I let him yell until he ran out of steam. Then I told him calmly that I wasn't going to help him crush our daughter's spirit in the name of modesty. David said I'd just destroyed our marriage, that there was no coming back from this level of disrespect. I told him our marriage was already destroyed the moment he demanded total submission instead of partnership, that I'd tried to compromise and he'd refused, that I'd begged him to see what this was doing to Lily and he'd doubled down, that I was done pretending his rigidity was the same as righteousness. He said I'd regret this, that he'd make sure I lost custody for being an unfit mother who exposed our daughter to immodest situations. I told him I'd already spoken to a lawyer, that I had documentation of everything, that family courts cared about children's well-being more than parents' religious preferences. His eyes widened. He asked if I was threatening divorce. I said I was preparing to protect our daughter, that what happened to our marriage was up to him. If he could find a way to be reasonable and compromise, maybe we could survive this. If not, I was ready to leave. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he grabbed his keys and left the house. I heard his car peel out of the driveway and sat down at the kitchen table shaking. I'd just crossed a line we couldn't uncross. I called Rebecca Thornton and told her what happened. She said I'd done the right thing standing up for Lily, but that I needed to be prepared for David to escalate. She advised me to open a separate bank account immediately and transfer half our savings, to gather important documents like birth certificates and tax returns, to document this confrontation, to be ready to file for separation if David became aggressive or controlling. She said that by directly defying his ultimatum, I'd shifted the power dynamic and he wouldn't take that well. I spent the rest of the afternoon following her instructions, opening accounts, gathering papers, writing down every detail of our fight. Lily came downstairs around dinner time and asked where Dad was. I said he'd left and I wasn't sure when he'd be back. She asked if this was her fault and I told her absolutely not. That night, David didn't come home. He didn't answer my calls or texts. I put Lily to bed and lay awake listening for his car. Around midnight, he finally pulled in. I heard him come upstairs and go straight to our bedroom. I stayed in the guest room. In the morning, I found him in the kitchen making coffee. He looked exhausted. I asked where he'd been, and he said at his friend Kevin's house, that he'd needed time to think and pray. I waited for him to say more. He told me he'd talked to his pastor about our situation, that Pastor Glenn had said I was in rebellion against godly authority, and that David needed to take a firm stand. That if he allowed me to override his decisions, it would destroy his ability to lead our family. I asked if Pastor Glenn had any concern for Lily's emotional well-being. David said the pastor believed children needed structure and boundaries, not indulgence of every desire. I told him ballet wasn't a desire. It was Lily's identity and talent and passion. He said that proved how dangerous it was, that anything that became more important than God was an idol that needed to be destroyed. I stared at him, realizing there was no middle ground here. He'd been completely captured by this toxic theology that saw threats everywhere and love as control. I told him I wanted a separation, that we could try counseling if he was willing, but I couldn't live under his authority structure anymore. He said if I separated from him, I'd be abandoning my marriage vows. I told him he'd already abandoned our partnership when he started making unilateral decisions and demanding submission. We stood there in our kitchen 12 years after we'd promised to love and cherish each other, and neither of us knew how to bridge the gap that had opened between us. David said he'd move out temporarily to give us both space, that he'd be staying with Kevin. He wanted to see Lily regularly, but acknowledged we needed time apart. I was surprised by his willingness to leave, but also relieved. Space might let both of us think more clearly. David packed a bag and left that afternoon. Lily watched from her window as his car drove away. She came downstairs and asked if we were getting divorced. I told her we were separated for now, that sometimes parents needed space to figure things out. She nodded and then asked if she could keep doing ballet. I told her yes, that as long as I had any say, she'd be dancing. She hugged me and said she was sorry everything was so messed up. I told her none of this was her fault, that adults were responsible for their own choices. Over the next few weeks, a new routine developed. David would pick up Lily on Friday evenings and bring her back Sunday afternoons. During those weekends, he took her to church and tried to enroll her in various Christian activities. Lily went along with it to keep the peace, but told me she mostly felt uncomfortable and watched. That her dad kept giving her books about modesty and purity. That he'd lecture her about staying close to God and avoiding worldly influences. She said she just nodded and stayed quiet until he brought her home. During the week with me, Lily blossomed. She attended ballet 4 times a week and her skills improved rapidly. Grace entered her in a regional competition and she placed 3rd in her age division. She made new friends at the studio and started smiling again. I watched her come back to life and knew I'd made the right choice even though it cost me my marriage. Rebecca Thornton filed separation papers officially. We established temporary custody with Lily living primarily with me and visiting David every other weekend. The court ordered us to attempt mediation before proceeding to full custody hearings. The mediator was a calm older woman named Frances Delgado, who'd been doing family mediation for 20 years. She met with David and me separately first to hear our perspectives. When I met with Frances, I explained everything about the ballet ban and David's increasing rigidity and my fear that he'd continue restricting Lily's life in harmful ways. Frances listened carefully and asked if David had ever been violent or threatening. I said no, never physical, just emotionally controlling and increasingly rigid. Frances said emotional control and manipulation could be just as damaging as physical abuse, and that she'd keep that in mind. She asked what outcome I wanted. I told her honestly that I wanted shared custody where both of us had input on major decisions. But I also wanted clear boundaries, that David couldn't unilaterally ban Lily from activities she loved, that he couldn't use his religious beliefs as justification for crushing her dreams. Frances nodded and said she'd see what she could work out. The joint mediation session happened the following week. David and I sat on opposite sides of a conference table with Frances between us. She started by laying out ground rules. No interrupting, no personal attacks. Focus on Lily's needs rather than scoring points against each other. Then she asked David to explain his perspective on the ballet issue. David talked for 20 minutes about modesty and protecting innocence and the sexualization of children in modern culture. He said ballet costumes revealed too much of young girls' bodies and trained them to be comfortable displaying themselves for audiences. He said this desensitized them to immodesty and made them vulnerable to worldly values. He never once mentioned Lily specifically, or her passion for dance, or what banning it had done to her emotionally. When he finished, Frances asked him if he'd noticed any changes in Lily's mood or behavior after he banned ballet. He said she'd been upset initially, but that was expected when children had to give up something they enjoyed. That the temporary sadness was worth it for long-term character development. Frances turned to me and asked for my perspective. I talked about Lily's devastation and withdrawal, how she'd stopped listening to music and practicing her positions, how the light had gone out of her eyes. I described finding her crying in her room surrounded by pictures of dancers. I explained that ballet wasn't just a hobby but her identity and talent, that taking it away had damaged something fundamental in her. I mentioned Grace's observations about Lily's transformation when she was allowed back in the studio. Frances took notes on everything. Then she asked David if he'd be willing to compromise. Maybe allow ballet but with adjusted costumes or limited performances. David said no. That compromising on moral issues taught children that values were negotiable. Frances asked what other restrictions he planned to implement as Lily got older. David listed several things. No social media, no dating before college, approval required for all friendships, only Christian colleges allowed. Frances's expression didn't change, but I saw her making lots of notes. She asked if David saw any potential problems with the level of control he was describing. He said godly parents were supposed to guide their children carefully, that the world was full of dangers and his job was to protect Lily from them. Frances ended the session by saying she'd prepare a recommendation for the court. She said both of us clearly loved Lily but had very different parenting philosophies, that the court would need to decide which approach served Lily's best interests. We left the mediation, and I felt cautiously hopeful. David had revealed exactly how controlling his plans were, and Frances had documented all of it. A week later, Frances submitted her recommendation to the court. Rebecca called me to discuss it. Frances had recommended primary physical custody to me with regular visitation for David. She'd also recommended that decisions about Lily's extracurricular activities and education be made jointly with a mediator's input if we couldn't agree. Most importantly, she'd included language preventing either parent from unilaterally banning activities without demonstrating actual harm to the child. Rebecca said this was a strong recommendation in my favor. That judges usually followed mediator recommendations unless one party had compelling evidence otherwise. David's lawyer would likely try to paint me as undermining religious freedom, but the evidence of Lily's emotional distress under David's restrictions and her flourishing with more freedom would be hard to argue against. The custody hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, Lily continued thriving. She'd been cast in a leading role in the studio's winter showcase. Grace told me she was one of the most naturally talented young dancers she'd taught in years, that with continued training, Lily could potentially earn scholarships to prestigious dance programs. I took photos of Lily at every class and wrote down her comments about how much she loved ballet. I documented her improving grades and expanding friendships. I built a clear timeline showing the direct correlation between being allowed to dance and her overall well-being. David exercised his visitation, but the weekends with him became increasingly tense. Lily told me he kept trying to convince her that ballet was wrong, that he'd shown her videos about the dangers of performance culture, that he'd taken her to meet with Pastor Glenn, who told her that obedient daughters honored their father's wisdom. She said she just agreed with everything to make the visits end faster. I asked if she felt safe with him, and she said yes. He wasn't mean or scary, just exhausting and sad. She said it felt like he was trying to turn her into someone she wasn't. The night before the custody hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept running through everything that might happen. What if the judge sided with David's religious freedom argument? What if Lily was forced to quit ballet again? What if the court decided shared decision-making meant David could veto anything he wanted? Rebecca had assured me our case was strong, but nothing was guaranteed. I got up at dawn and made coffee and reviewed all my documentation one more time. The courthouse was downtown in a building that smelled like old wood and floor polish. Rebecca met me in the lobby, and we went through security together. She'd prepared me thoroughly for what to expect. The judge would hear from both sides, review Frances's recommendation and all the evidence, possibly speak with Lily privately, and then make a ruling. David was already in the courtroom with his lawyer when we arrived. He wouldn't look at me. We sat on opposite sides and waited for the judge. Judge Dorothy Whitmore came in and everyone stood. She was maybe 60 with steel gray hair and sharp eyes. She reviewed the case file for a few minutes and then asked David's lawyer to present their position. His lawyer was a man named Richard Kemp, who specialized in religious freedom cases. He argued for 45 minutes about parental rights and religious liberty and the importance of fathers having authority in their families. He painted me as hostile to David's faith and trying to prevent him from raising our daughter according to his values. He said ballet's revealing costumes genuinely violated David's sincere religious beliefs and that courts shouldn't force parents to compromise on deeply held convictions. He presented character witnesses from David's church who testified that he was a devoted father concerned about his daughter's moral development. Pastor Glenn testified that David had come to him genuinely troubled about Lily's ballet and seeking guidance on protecting her innocence. When it was Rebecca's turn, she methodically dismantled their arguments. She presented Frances's mediation report highlighting David's plans for extensive future restrictions. She showed the timeline of Lily's emotional decline after the ballet ban and her recovery after resuming. She had Grace Carmichael testify via video about Lily's talent and the dramatic difference in her demeanor between being banned from dance and being allowed to participate. Grace's testimony was powerful. She described finding Lily crying in the studio the day we returned. Lily telling her she'd felt like she was suffocating, the visible transformation once she was dancing again. Rebecca presented my documentation of everything: the journal entries, the recordings of conversations, the photos showing Lily's progression. She argued that while David's religious beliefs deserved respect, they didn't justify imposing restrictions that caused documented psychological harm. That Lily had a right to develop her talents, and that ballet had been central to her identity since age 4. That David's real concern wasn't modesty, but control. Judge Whitmore asked Rebecca to clarify that point. Rebecca explained that David's restrictions went far beyond ballet, that he'd outlined plans to control Lily's friendships, education, social media, and dating life. That the ballet ban was just the first in what would be an escalating pattern of isolation and control disguised as religious protection. She said the court needed to protect Lily from this trajectory while still preserving her relationship with her father. Judge Whitmore asked if Lily could be brought in to speak with her privately. The bailiff went to get Lily from the waiting room where she'd been with my sister. A few minutes later, Lily came in looking tiny and nervous in her dress. Judge Whitmore smiled at her kindly and explained that she just wanted to hear Lily's perspective on some things. They went into the judge's chambers alone. David and I and our lawyers all waited in tense silence. After 30 minutes, they came back out. Lily sat in the gallery next to my sister. Judge Whitmore took her seat and looked at both of us seriously. She said she'd reviewed all the evidence and heard all the testimony and spoken with Lily directly, that this case involved balancing several important interests: a father's right to guide his child's moral development, a mother's concern about emotional harm, and most importantly, a child's right to develop her talents and identity in a healthy environment. Judge Whitmore said that while she respected David's religious convictions, the evidence clearly showed that his restrictions were causing significant emotional distress to Lily, that Lily had articulated to her personally how important ballet was to her sense of self, that the documented decline in her mental health after the ban and her improvement after resuming were too significant to ignore. The judge said she was granting primary physical custody to me with visitation rights for David every other weekend and 1 evening per week. She was also ruling that decisions about Lily's extracurricular activities would require mutual agreement or mediation, that neither parent could unilaterally ban activities without showing concrete evidence of harm, and that given Lily's age and maturity, her preferences about her own activities would be given significant weight in any future disputes. Judge Whitmore looked directly at David and said she understood his concerns came from a place of love, but that love sometimes meant allowing children to grow into their own people rather than controlling every aspect of their development. She said she hoped he could find a way to support Lily's passion, even if it made him uncomfortable. That being a father meant sometimes putting his daughter's needs above his own preferences. She banged her gavel and the hearing was over. I felt my whole body sag with relief. Rebecca squeezed my hand. Lily looked stunned but hopeful. David sat frozen in his seat. His lawyer touched his shoulder and said something I couldn't hear. David stood up and walked out of the courtroom without looking at any of us. In the hallway, Lily hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. She was crying and laughing at the same time. She asked if this meant she could really keep dancing. I told her yes, that the judge had protected her right to ballet, that nothing was going to take it away from her again. My sister joined us, and the three of us stood there holding each other while people streamed past us to other courtrooms and other cases. Rebecca finished paperwork and came out to tell us the official custody order would be filed within a week, that it was legally binding, and if David violated it, there would be serious consequences. She said I'd done everything right, that protecting Lily had required courage, and I'd shown it. Over the next few months, a new normal developed. Lily lived with me during the week and visited David every other weekend. Those visits remained strained, but David had backed off the lectures about modesty after the judge's ruling. Lily told me he seemed quieter during their time together, less certain about everything. She said he'd actually asked her about her ballet and listened when she talked about her upcoming performances. It wasn't the relationship they used to have, but it was something. Lily's showcase performance was beautiful. She danced a solo that brought tears to my eyes, not because the technique was perfect, though it was impressive for her age, but because watching her move across that stage, I could see pure joy, the freedom to be exactly who she was meant to be. After the performance, Grace pulled me aside. She said she wanted to talk about Lily's future, that several of her dancers had gone on to professional companies and prestigious programs, that Lily had that same potential if she wanted to pursue it. Grace said she'd be honored to write recommendations and help connect Lily with opportunities when the time came. I thanked her for seeing my daughter's talent and fighting for her. Grace said she'd seen too many girls forced out of dance by controlling parents, that she'd made it her mission to protect dancers when she could, that Lily's case had reminded her why that mattered. David and I finally had a real conversation 3 months after the custody hearing. He asked to meet for coffee without lawyers present. I agreed cautiously. We sat across from each other in a chain cafe, and the awkwardness was overwhelming at first. Finally, David said he'd been doing a lot of thinking, that losing custody had forced him to examine his beliefs and motivations. He said his therapist, someone Pastor Glenn had actually recommended after the hearing, had helped him see how his fear had been driving his need for control. That he'd been so terrified of Lily being corrupted by the world that he'd tried to build walls around her instead of teaching her to navigate challenges. I asked if he still believed ballet costumes were immodest. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said honestly, yes, he still felt uncomfortable with them. But he'd realized his discomfort didn't have to control Lily's choices. David said he'd watched videos of her winter showcase performance that I'd sent. That seeing her dance had reminded him of why he'd supported it for so many years. That her joy was real and her talent was real, and taking that away had been wrong regardless of his religious concerns. He said he was sorry. For the rigidity, for the ultimatums, for not listening to what I'd been trying to tell him, for damaging our marriage and hurting Lily. I told him I appreciated the apology. That I knew his intentions had come from love even if his methods were destructive. He asked if there was any chance we could eventually reconcile. I told him honestly I didn't know. That too much had broken between us. That I'd learned I couldn't live under someone's authority structure. That if we ever rebuilt anything, it would have to be as genuine equals. He nodded and said he understood. That he'd lost that right when he'd chosen control over partnership. We talked for another hour about Lily and scheduling and how to co-parent better going forward. It wasn't the marriage we'd had, but it was a better divorce than many people managed. A year after the custody hearing, Lily auditioned for a prestigious summer intensive program at a professional ballet company. She was one of only 30 dancers selected from hundreds of applicants. The program would give her training with world-class instructors and exposure to the professional dance world. When the acceptance letter came, Lily screamed and jumped around our living room. Then she asked if she could call her dad to tell him. I said of course. I listened to her excited voice on the phone describing the program. I heard David's response, though I couldn't make out words. When she hung up, she said he'd told her he was proud of her, that he was sorry he'd almost taken this away from her, that he hoped she'd never stop dancing. Lily asked if I thought he really meant it. I told her yes, that people could change and grow even after causing harm, that her dad was trying to be better, and that mattered. Now, 2 years after everything fell apart, I stood in the audience watching Lily perform in her studio's annual gala. She was 13 now and dancing on point with strength and grace that took my breath away. David was sitting 3 rows behind me. After the performance, we both went backstage to congratulate her. She hugged us both, and her happiness was so pure and complete. A photographer asked if we wanted a family photo with Lily in her costume. David and I looked at each other awkwardly. Then Lily grabbed both our hands and pulled us together. The 3 of us smiled for the camera. Not an intact family, but a healing one. Later that night, after dropping Lily at David's for his weekend, I drove home thinking about how far we'd all come. How close I'd come to letting David's fear crush our daughter's spirit. How standing up for her had cost me my marriage but saved her childhood. How sometimes love meant fighting even when it destroyed everything else. Lily was going to be okay. More than okay. She was going to dance. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.